So thank you so much, Piera, for allowing us to see a preview of this amazing video. So I'm going to introduce you all to the wonderful Piera Vanderweel. She's a British singer, songwriter, and actor passionate about social impact and storytelling. And she's the founder of her collective Stronger with Music that promotes the importance of music and mental health and music and social impact. She's worked and performed with NGOs globally, including the Barefoot College International, Applaud Our Kids Foundation, at 54 Below, at the Aspire Artists Foundation events, and has sung at the UN headquarters for International Women's Day as well. Thank you so much, Piera, for joining us. Please tell us about this video and what inspired you and what you're doing with this amazing video, the activism and everything behind that.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for playing the video, very special screening. So the official video of my single Used will be released on the 28th of September, which is actually the opening and beginning day of Signal for Help Awareness Week with the Canadian Women's Foundation. So that will be the day when it will be officially released. I released a single actually back in May during Mental Health Awareness Month. And what I've been doing is with the single is really raising awareness of these ever increasing numbers of domestic violence due to COVID-19. And really what I believe in is that music can be utilized as a new tool into bringing awareness to women and girls who are suffering from violence all over and all around the world during this hard time. And as we all know, during COVID-19, during 2020, we've been having to quarantine and isolate inside our homes. But what I wanted to bring about and to raise awareness of is that it's not always a safe place to be, and that these numbers have increased exponentially during this quarantine timeframe. And I wanted to do my part in supporting victims of domestic abuse, and I felt strongly that I wanted to connect Used with this cause. And my song Used is, when I wrote it, it is an emotional roller coaster, how one can feel so safe, that when you let your barriers down, you can feel used and abused and taken for granted. But what was important for me is I wanted to end it with this lasting positive message of strength and hope. And with the video showing the hand signal is to really show how we can educate ourselves and also help educate the victims of how not only do we need to verbally communicate, but also nonverbal communication is also vitally important when you're a victim of domestic abuse.
Thank you so much for that. And you're raising funds and awareness for the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women with that song. So you're always activism based as well and doing something to help those who are suffering as well. So thank you so much for that. Tell us a little bit about your inspiration behind raising funds for causes across the globe, in fact. As you continue to do so with all of your songs, and you have one coming out as well to raise awareness on climate change and oceans.
Yes, so currently right now I'm working on an ocean conservation song, which I'm very excited. I'm working with a Canadian producer and also a Bahamian producer. So due to the Hurricane Dorian last year that destroyed the Abaco Islands, there was about 30 years of debris that went into the oceans within a period of 3 days. So I'm also working on this ocean conservation song. But Used, this specific song, I wanted to make sure that during this time I was highlighting these women. And it's the shadow pandemic that we're currently living in. And I know for a fact that Refuge UK, which is an NGO in England, they had a 700% increase in hotline calls. But then there are other parts of the world that said there was a decrease, which they found more scary. The fact that these women and girls were unable or felt they were unable to call and get the resources that they need. And that's been also a very scary time.
Well, thank you so much for the amazing work that you do, and thank you for joining us and for allowing us to see this preview of your video. Continue to be amazing and blazing trails and helping others while you do that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
So I wanted to just start by giving some stage setting remarks, and I'll just go through very quickly, and I will put it later on at the end of the month, all of the speeches on our website. So human rights violations and gender-based violence against women have been taking place for centuries, but has been difficult to combat due to multifarious reasons. These lay in cultural traditions and perceptions of socially prescribed gender relations, roles, and obligations. Gender-based violence, in most cases, takes place in the private sphere with primarily traditional, social, religious, or cultural reinforcement. COVID-19, as Piera pointed out, has forced an increase in gender-based violence, as many have been spending more time at home where safety is not always ensured. According to UN Women, 1 in 5, that's 18%, have faced violence from an intimate partner in the past year. The social construction of perceived gender obligations has played a significant role in curtailing the success of strategies put forth by international organizations to combat these extreme forms of gender-based violence. Women are abused in their homes by their husbands, in the streets by strangers who rape them, by mothers or grandmothers who genitally mutilate them, by their religion, which is perceived to demand that women be treated as subordinate, or by their court system, culture, and society, which may allow them to be stoned to death, burned by acid, self-immolated, trafficked, or left without a choice in cases of abortion. And many have limited the prosecution of perpetrators while blaming the victims. Women in many cultures are told that they are not as important as men are, that they are lesser human beings, and their existence consists of serving men, respecting their husbands, and being obedient in order to be rewarded by God. Women have been oppressed strictly because of their gender and sexuality, and this is an ignored aspect of human rights violations. But as Peters and Wolper pointed out as far back as 1995, in their Women's Rights, Human Rights compilation, women from every single culture and every part of the world are standing up and saying, we won't accept cultural justification for abuses against us anymore. We are human. We have a right to have our human rights protected, and the world community must respond to that call and throw out any attempts to justify abuse on the grounds of culture or religion. In some communities, women are treated unequally in many important ways, and often they have no opportunity to obtain a reasonable education. Even educated and accomplished women struggle in virtually all societies to break through the glass ceiling. In almost all societies, women are seen as second-class citizens, and their status and importance are oftentimes tied to men's. International instruments and international fora have clearly pointed to the fact that women experience human rights violations in a different manner than men do because of their biological makeup, their physical differences, and their reproductive abilities. Violations of their naturally ordained human rights often take place. In many cultures across the globe, women live with an insurmountable amount of obstructions and hardship due to their perceived role in society. This, in turn, creates an image of what a woman should be. The use of the term gender equity is thought to preserve and disseminate stereotypes about the perceived role of women in their societies and the duties they are to carry out based on their roles. Under human rights law, the standard to be met is substantive equality, or equality of all outcomes. It takes into account the biological differences of women, compensates for historical discrimination, and means that in some cases, men and women are not treated with the exact same approach due to those differences. Substantive equality is the preferred global approach. Though we have made several advancements, the reality is that too few women reach the top echelons of politics, business, or religion. Thus, women have few decision-making rights and powers. This is even more the case in developing countries around the world. The notion that a woman's emotions guide her decision-making, in turn, leading her to make irrational choices and uninformed decisions, is paramount in the minds of many, both men and women. Women are seen as too emotional to guard their own rights. I have noted that many challenges remain in adapting local understandings of women's rights as embodied in customs, practices, and values to the specifications and constraints of the CEDAW. But in many countries across the world, challenges remain in determining whether the violence that takes place against women on a daily basis is a human rights violation, especially when it relates to transnational and local crimes. It is therefore necessary to label human rights violations as such, especially when it concerns harmful traditional practices and gender-based violence. Violence is one violation of human rights, and violence against women needs to be dealt with as a crime. It is important to deal with the root causes of violence, which often lie in complex issues such as corruption or economic, social, or political struggles within countries. If the state deprioritizes addressing those causes to deal with issues affecting women, then women's rights will be insufficiently addressed. Human rights are fundamental and essential. They are universal in character. They are prima facie and interdependent in nature. They are no longer just a Western concept, as respect for fundamental human rights is being called for in every part of the globe. Grassroots organizations, civil society, NGOs, and international organizations are demanding respect for human rights. In cases in local courts and international courts, human rights violations have been deemed as illegal and have been prosecuted. As human beings, we desire to live a life filled with comfort, happiness, security, and safety, an overall sense of well-being. Yet in our world today, certain influences, both internal and external, whether social or natural, hamper us from realizing this life and infringe on our abilities to live full, equal, and free lives where certain inalienable rights are guaranteed. The safety and security of individual citizens, especially women, is an issue, especially after wars, and it cannot be always guaranteed. So these can include the breakdown of institutions and the reduced capacity of governments and legal systems within the country. Aside from this, many states to begin with do not all guarantee rights that protect women from harmful traditional practices or gender-based violence. Until individual states ratify the treaties in place and adapt their national laws to combat instances of gender-based violence, progress will not be made. We must, however, respect that the Western view of human rights may not be attractive in other countries. Women in other countries may have other ways of expressing their worth and may demand more strict or more comprehensive methods that uphold their dignity and worth. It is imperative for women to learn that it is not a taboo to question what they see as wrong as they become more empowered to demand change. In many religions, women's rights were actually envisioned, and we must continue to argue for legislation allowing for prosecution of crimes as crimes, not tied specifically to religion. Many movements for gender equality have come from within the Muslim, Christian, or Judaic world, even some initially led by men. Some people may take issue with the term feminist, but whatever we call them, many people, both men and women, have championed women's rights across the world. Their efforts have had an impact. It is important for us not to also push cultural relativist agendas, though. When all members of a group are considered responsible for the wrongdoing of a few, those others can feel slighted, exposed, and unprotected, and in turn seek ways to protect themselves and their societies. This may in some circumstances lead them to see the need to assert their dominance and assume certain roles in the society. Words can be taken out of context to further political, economic, or social agendas. Social interaction is important in the international arena, and human behavior drives actions of states and can shift, change, or inform policy decisions. We need to employ a holistic approach, but also compare, challenge, and highlight how the social construction of perceived gender roles has led people to manipulate the ideals of justice, peace, and equality for personal, political, or social ends, leading to violence against women, violation of human rights, and denial of human dignity for political, social, or economic ends. We have to combat patriarchal systems and its subsequent misogynistic interpretations. International organizations can collaborate with religious women's groups in locally catered contexts to forge a way towards reinterpreting fundamental documents of religious-based jurisprudence so that the jurisprudence takes into account the rights and values of women. The groups can do so through increased funding for this cause and pressuring local governments to do the same. There are many willing, both men and women, to seek a balanced and gender-neutral viewpoint. Many religious men across the globe believe in the notion of strong women and push for education, justice, and respect for women's rights. International legal instruments need to be able to have sufficient global and local bite in order for the work that the organizations that help in forging laws against gender-based violence to be taken seriously. The lack of political will to enact, uphold legislation, and the lack of sufficient prosecution when discrimination, violence, and abuse takes place is also a fundamental problem. The underlying issue is that women's rights are not part of the real agenda when it comes to creating policy frameworks that actually protect women as obligated under the UDHR and CEDAW. This lack of attention can become exacerbated when religion or culture is involved. In essence, when social constructs, culture, or religion are paramount, it becomes difficult to enact international laws that infringe on a belief or practice that in essence is personal and cultural. In the instances that there are indeed laws put into place for gender-based violence and human rights abuses committed against women, there lies a problem with enforcement. The UN recognizes that gender-based violence highlights and strengthens injustices and inequities between both men and women and can hinder the security, health, dignity, and autonomy of its victims. Aside from violence and psychological abuse, women face discrimination that is geared towards them specifically because of their gender, whether it is social, political, economic, educational, institutional, or otherwise. Women face barriers towards advancements in their societies, families, and communities. Politics, culture, tradition, and religion continue to be used as scapegoats for violating women's rights. It is imperative that we view international law and international human rights law through a gendered lens in order to analyze the differences in ways women and men experience discrimination, violence, and abuse. There is a hierarchy of roles, and certainly an unequal power distribution, as well as differences in decision-making powers and roles. It is necessary to deconstruct where violence and abuse stems from. When violence occurs in some communities, culture is blamed, and others, only individuals are accused or faulted. And this is quoted also in Peters and Wolper. So let's move to action, education, and support so that the situation of women globally could be remedied. Thank you, and I look forward to a wonderful discussion. I will give it to Asabi Rawlins to moderate the rest of the discussion and introduce the keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Hermina, thank you so much for an all-encompassing situational overview of everything that's happening with respect to violence against women and girls. And Piera, thank you so much for using your music and your passion for a positive cause. I'm deeply and personally invested in today's conversation. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago originally, and every time I look at the news, there's another tragic incident of women being not just brutalized, but murdered by men, their former partners, former spouses. In July this year, one woman was murdered on her way to the police station to report her abuser. It seems that every week, another story like this is on the front page of Trinidad and Tobago's newspapers. When I was growing up, murder-suicides were so prevalent, but people trivialized these atrocities. They said damaging things like suicide is demonstrable evidence that the love is strong. And I think we need a paradigm shift in the way we think about gender-based violence. There's a bit of shock when incidents of violence against women and girls come to the fore, but then the activism and public discontent soon dissipates. And this is really problematic, this cycle of activism and retreat. We need consistency in how we respond to these atrocities. I want to emphasize that I do not believe this is an issue for generalizations or victim blaming. The victims of gender-based violence are never at fault. There is nothing that anyone can ever do that warrants them being abused by another person. We often hear that becoming educated and empowered means that walking away is a viable solution, but gender-based violence is far more complex. We cannot place the onus for it on the victims themselves. The sad fact is that education and empowerment are not the only options. There are socioeconomic, psychosocial, family, and other factors to be considered. All of that said, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. It is saddening that we are facing a situation of increased violence due to stay-at-home orders and the effects of COVID-19. It is maddening, but I'm hopeful and inspired that because we are here on this forum, using our global voices to speak, it can be an inspiration to others as well. I know that talking is not enough. We need concrete actions and solutions. But we have an esteemed panel who are in their own right undertaking meaningful work to address gender-based violence. And they reflect the fact that there's a need for action at multiple levels, the community level, national, international levels. So hopefully today we can not just talk, but speak to some actionable measures that can be taken. So I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Her Excellency Rosalyn Hazelle, a former ambassador at large hailing from St. Kitts and Nevis. She's committed to the elimination of violence and abuse against all women. Ambassador Hazelle championed the passing of the Domestic Violence Act in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis and played a critical role in the special policy provisions to reintegrate adolescent mothers into schools. Additionally, she also spearheaded a movement in St. Kitts and Nevis that ensured pregnant teens had the opportunity to continue their education and receive information about their sexual and reproductive health. So join me in welcoming Ambassador Rosalyn Hazelle.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Greetings to all the participants. On the onset, please allow me to thank and congratulate the organizers of this very important and timely forum. I think the discussion today is going to be instructive for many of us, all of us, in various ways. We all bring to the table different experiences, and we're all ready and willing to continue the work that we know is very needed. So it's an honor for me to be asked to participate. I think the discussion today brings light to a pervasive issue that has continued throughout my career. I have spoken in many different conferences, forums, but during COVID, the conversation seems to have become even more critical. It is at a crisis stage because services as we know them are no longer, it seems, adequate. I liked very much the Canadian Women Foundation and the sign that says help. And I think that that's something that we really need to get out there because there are victims that are stuck at home, and it only goes to show that we have a lot of work left to do. As I prepared for this today, I wondered, what about not just our voices, but the voices of victims? Can we find a way to bring those to the forefront? In a recent conversation with one of my daughters, who is a youth psychologist, she worried about the increase of cases and more clients, being male and female, are reporting physical and sexual abuse. So again, we're seeing that no one escapes. There is no socioeconomic, there is no age, there is no religion, there is no geographic location that determine these things. Like many of us, she expressed that her clients and herself feel increased helplessness as services and protections do not seem accessible, available, or even adequate, which presents us with a greater problem. While seeking solution to the health crisis by lockdown and quarantine, the global pandemic has highlighted increased urgency in addressing the social issues of gender-based violence, inclusive of domestic violence and sexual violence as well. These acts of violation against our people continue to plague us worldwide. For persons subjected to gender-based violence, the discomfort we feel about measures keeping us safe, keeping us at home, can never be comparable to what the victims are feeling. They are experiencing the idea of being stuck at home, watching a simmering pot, hoping that it will not boil over. When escape comes from going to one's job or spending time outside the home to avoid abuse is no longer available, do we even want to imagine being in a lockdown with a frustrated tormentor or abuser? How do we protect our children from predators at home as well as in their social circle? What about women who achieve empowerment and freedom? I'm glad to hear the moderator touch on the whole idea that education and empowerment does not address the issue. And often we feel and we throw around these words and these concepts as if they are the solution. They're not. A woman who is empowered in the workplace doesn't necessarily transfer to a woman being empowered in her home. What about women who achieve economic and professional pursuit? What is being done to address the financial vulnerability that they now face with unemployment? Job loss or layoff making one even more dependent and more vulnerable. We know these, and even worse realities exist for far too many. Life has changed not only for the vulnerable and at-risk population, but the reality has changed for us, for governments, for those of us who are working in civil societies, the helpers, the advocates, because if COVID is highlighting the problem, it also shed light on the response or the lack thereof. These create a few more burning questions and hopefully Through today's discussion, we can generate answers and reignite the flame of all our past efforts and achievements. It is saddening for me, who have been out there with so many other people for so long, championing these issues. And today in 2020, we're faced with these issues even more poignant maybe than they have been before in all of our countries. For decades, so many of us have tried to address the scourge in our midst. There have been conferences, workshops, UN declaration, international and regional conventions aimed at preventing, eliminating, and punishing acts of violence and abuse against women and children, whether in the public or the private sphere. We have seen our government sign and ratify conventions, support declarations, support outcome documents. Some have even enacted laws on domestic violence, sexual offenses, etc. Yet, we are so far from prevention, real punishment, or worse yet, eradication of these acts of abuse and violence, mostly against our women and our girls. It feels like we have only scratched the surface. Why is this so? Can it be because many governments only pay lip service to these very serious human rights violations? Is achieving zero tolerance and in the act of violence in our society merely a pipe dream? It cannot be. What do we all think? And I'm hoping that the discussion today will get us closer to answers. Many, if not all of our countries have signed and ratified CEDAW. Among all of the other international human rights instruments, yet in 2020, some are comfortable to treat or couch gender-based violence in cultural, religious, or traditional practices. Will they be allowed to continue these infractions unabatedly? Where is the collective international outcry when it is so needed? When will we see sanction placed on countries for their blatant inaction? Obviously, the naming and shaming of our governments is not a deterrent. So what then would be the role of civil society? Like the Council of Europe, Istanbul's Convention on combating violence against women and domestic violence, 2011, there also exists the Organization of American States, the OAS, convention, which encompasses Canada, the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, with very similar commitments under their convention on the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence against women, more commonly known as Belém do Pará, which came into force in 1994. The signing and ratification of these two documents should be a signal that our countries are ready and prepared to address the issues ahead with national laws, regulations, policies, partnershiping with NGOs and civil society. Can we truly say that we see evidence of this? In the Caribbean, Most, if not all of our countries have enacted domestic violence legislation to various degrees. Some criminalize the action of abuse while others treat it as a summary offense. The thinking being that women who are abused may be reluctant to report, as it criminalizes their husbands, their partners, their lovers, as if those titles eliminates or erase a title that we all know needs to be more highlighted: the abusers. To my knowledge, only 2 countries in the Caribbean, Belize and St. Kitts Nevis, have nationalized the Bolem du Para in their Domestic Violence Act. As these violation continues unabated, can we say these instruments are being used effectively? From my vantage point, many seem toothless in the absence of regulations, policies, mechanisms to support victims, adequate funding, and other programs to enforce them, to include training of police officers and the judiciary. Training must form part of the course requirement for police and the judiciary. Support service where they exist are often inadequate, and counseling and rehabilitation services are absent to a large degree. This reality begs the question: are there adequate services to address the increased need in light of this pandemic? Is it that our governments are more focused on the economics to consider the human right toll of this increase in problems? I hear governments speak about the unemployment, the various budgetary processes. I'm not hearing much of anyone speaking about the human toll. How is civil society able to address this? How can we use the tools, the instruments, the agreements our governments have signed and ratified to develop new strategies and to demand new action? Interestingly enough, this brings me back from my professional story to the personal, where I spoke about my daughter earlier. This daughter, with increased cases, has become an advocate for those who are sexually traumatized, using the legal system through the same domestic violence legislation in St. Kitts and Nevis that I spoke of. She's using it to help victims to advocate for their own protection. The legislation has always been there. In fact, it was in the late 90s when I, as the Director of Gender Affairs, worked assiduously for its creation and enactment, and later as the Permanent Secretary, pushing for enforcement. But it would seem that only now in COVID that there is a realization of the far-reaching rights that have been established in this legislation. A unique time can always make an impact and ask us to look at these issues through new lenses, or maybe even wipe the dust off of the old ones. In this sense, I would like to challenge all of us to take another look at these conventions, outcome documents, declaration, laws, policies, etc. Let's put them under a new microscope. Examine them for shortcomings and lack of regulations, etc., that may be barriers to their full implementation. It is time to redefine the objective, and create other strategies that can move us beyond where we still find ourselves. Whether we are NGOs, civil society, and politicians, it is a new call for advocating for action to bring about real change for the victims of gender-based violence and inclusive of domestic violence. Let's form allies with parliamentarians, mayors, councillors. Let's not leave anyone out, and let's be willing to name those that we find who are hindrances or presenting themselves as a block in the road towards this realization. In closing, let me state that the violation of human rights of so many must stop. It's time for a renewed movement to address gender-based violence. Let's think outside the box. We need to bring about some light in the tunnel for the prevention, punishment, and elimination of domestic abuse and all forms of violence perpetrated against women, be it in the private or the public sphere. Acknowledging that although a disproportionate amount of women are subjected to violence in the home, we must also recognize that some men are also victims. So let's decide to show up and speak up for all. How can we speak of respect of human rights, empowerment of our people, or the development of our nations when gender-based violence continues to violate the fundamental rights and freedom of so many of our citizens? I say, enough already. We must challenge the silence once again and shine a spotlight to bring the issue of gender-based violence and domestic violence back to the front burner where it belongs. It has sat at the back burner for way too long. The time to reignite is now. Time for the collective chant. Enough already. We must reignite the zero tolerance call, the zero tolerance attitude. Make COVID work for us, not against us. Let's use this pandemic to highlight the scourge of domestic violence and hopefully bring about in 2020 and beyond positive action to end gender-based violence. I thank you for listening. I am looking so forward to the discussion. I'm looking forward to the panelists, and I am very happy and hopeful that this is a springboard to serious action to bring about change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hazelle. I definitely found your remarks to be very, very much in line with my sentiments, particularly this false narrative of the empowered woman, and also the idea that women are not the only victims of gender-based violence. We definitely need to open up our understanding or perception of this issue if we are to truly combat gender-based violence in all its forms. So thank you very much. Before we delve into today's questions, I just want to introduce the rest of our panel. We have with us Angel Pai, an actress, TV host, model, designer, entrepreneur, and speaker. Having appeared in Hollywood movies and TV shows in the last decade, Angel has channeled her humanitarian drive through all aspects of her life, including media work such as segments on PBS All Arts. We also have with us Sheba George, the founder and managing trustee of Sarwaru. She has over 30 years experience working for women's development in both urban and rural settings. As a women's development trainer and activist, she has been instrumental in forming various women's groups and alliances to mitigate violence against women and girls. And finally, we have with us Sarthak Maggon, the principal advocate at Sarthak Maggon Law Offices. He's also the founder of Assimit Projects Foundation, a policy think tank. So I'm very excited for this diverse panel of actors. My first question to the panel, and please don't forget to raise your hand if you wish to respond, is that many people believe gender-based violence and abuse against women and girls can be eradicated through increased legislation, education, workforce development. But what linkages do you see between empowerment of women and girls and the reduction of gender-based violence? Would women in more leadership positions advance gender-specific legislation, such as those aimed at combating gender-based violence? And I also want to add one thing to that. Is it unfair of us to place that burden on women in leadership? Which is to say, I'm not discounting women in leadership, but is it fair to just attach that responsibility on women and women alone? I don't know if anyone on our panel wishes to comment.
Oh, we were waiting for you to recognize us. I think we can start with Angel.
Okay.
I was raising my hand in case someone else, waiting for everyone to speak. Good morning, everybody. To answer that question, just from the last thing you said, which is it our responsibility, or is it fair to attach that responsibility to women in leadership positions? And I think it's twofold. I think absolutely not fair to just attach that to women in leadership positions, because it needs to be from both sides. It's allies, right? We need allies, which means we need the male counterparts to enact on in such preventative measures, or however, piece of law or policy that they create. I don't think it can be just on women in leadership positions. Having said that, I do believe if there were more women in leadership positions, this issue will perhaps be much more addressed, coming from that female perspective. So I believe it's both. But speaking in that sense, I don't believe that it can only be on women and that it needs to be attached as part of their policies. But I believe that perhaps from that perspective, we are seeing kind of an understanding in all realms of their work, I would hope.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment? Sarthak, the floor is yours.
Yes, I think Sheba, was raising her hand. I can go in the end. Yes, Sheba, please.
Okay. Sheba.
Thank you, Sarthak. I couldn't find that spot where I could raise on the screen my hand. So very gentlemanly of you, Sarthak. Thank you so much. It's very healing in the environment we are in, and very encouraging to see you here amongst us. Firstly, I'd like to just take this moment to thank Rosella, because coming from a spectrum of experience, I think Dornella also is there. Many people like us who've been working for 3 decades now on national and international laws and trying to keep the micro to macro and macro to micro understanding in our groundwork, are really at this point very overwhelmed with the way violence is expanded, violence, the newer forms of violence that has overtaken the world. All of this is really problematic. And I feel, to answer particularly that whole question, while I agree with Angel that it should not be women's responsibility only, I do believe that it's necessary that cross-cutting there is a need that a critical mass of women leaders, women policy makers, actors should be there globally. Across all our regions, all our countries, there has to be an adequate number of women who can see through the fact that the policies created that are gender sensitive. So in the mass of women that we might see in leadership, for example, I'm coming from India at this moment. Unfortunately, many countries in this world are seeing very nationalist governments at this moment. And because of these kind of nationalist, masculine postures that national governments take, gender rights, gender human rights are really compromised. In that circumstances, the space for women leaders to act together is very important. And how do we get them to be in key posts? In key administrative posts, executive posts, implementation posts, so that those who are the frontline workers have support up to the top. So therefore, somehow, as much as the ideal situation is, it need not be a female gynecologist or a female lawyer or anything of that kind. I think it's still, unfortunately, we are at a place where we need a critical mass of women in each country, each region, from top to bottom, who are going to be able to implement, so that our people from other genders who are with us on this agenda can really try and maintain and keep our gains. At this point in the last 2-3 decades, we have so rapidly lost the gains made on gender. It's incredible. In my own lifetime, I mean, what started as a dream 30 years ago, when we could work on the ground at the grassroots as trained professional doctors, whatever else we are, as well as we had platforms, diocese on the global scenario where we could carry voices, get them back, get grassroots, get victim survivors to speak. Today that whole scenario has changed. Much of our language, our ideas have been co-opted by governments, and the way that governments are trying to give programs for women are quite patriarchal. So in one sense, the fight against patriarchy continues. Therefore, it's very critical that women actors are there in adequate number along with men and other genders to sort of see that we bring down gender-based violence and abuse of women, children, or any genders. I also just wanted to add, if I have a moment, if I'm not taking too much time, that I thought that since we have so much experience, this is the time to introduce adequate checks and balances. And in that, I think our evaluation systems are absent. We have no accountability, no answerabilities, penalization is not there, point responsibility if laws and systems fail, and programs, for example, in our country, India, if there is a law for rape that 1 lakh should be given to the survivor or victim, the way it's rolled out, it's as good as not getting it. Even under POCSO, when there is a child sexual abuse case, the way the support, even if they don't have counselors, they don't have the right people in place, so you'll find that a secretary or an accountant is coming to do the counseling further. I mean, this is my own experience for working with a child sexual abuse case. So if it's male or female or any other gender who are the victims, the point is that once national governments or regional governments put a law in place, they think their job is over. They don't need to see, is there a correct trained, well-trained psychologist there? We have a sexual harassment law in place. We have a Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. Every possible law. India is a country that is, on the top notch in laws. Gender just laws, we're really good. But in terms of implementation and having the trained, qualified people there, it's all absent. There's no integrity and accountability, and there is no way that you are going to hold the point person responsible for any kind of gaps or non-delivery. So somehow these standard operating procedures, penalization, our systems are not in place, infrastructure is not there, proper, I mean, this is just on the practical side. I'm not talking on the emotional side. So let's look at this as a business. You see, gender equality, gender justice is just another business. If it is another business, even if people can understand that it's very profitable to see that the world has less violence economically, for that much also it's very important that we get across into people's thick skulls that it's high time that they understand that a violence-free environment is completely non-negotiable when we are into wars, we are into conflict, and the whole globe is going through such recession. Can we afford this very expensive business of violence against the vulnerable people of this earth? May they be children, marginalized minorities, migrants, women, third gender, everything. See, so it's not working, and we have huge worries ahead because it's only nationalistic governments, so that everybody who's talking sense is seen as being against the government. So it's either my way or the highway. That's the way things are moving globally. So that is what is making it very difficult for us to handle gender-based violence. People will talk of mental health and many other things. But tell me who is speaking except us, our type of people and platforms. Where is the mainstream giving that much importance to gender-based violence or any of these issues? I'm sorry I've taken a lot of time. Thanks, Sarthak. Over to you.
Thank you, Shibaji. Thanks, Angel. Thank you, Asabi. I think so. I wouldn't first of all categorize myself in this particular very esteemed gathering as a gender expert. I think I'm, as a lawyer and as someone who works in the space or attempts to make his contribution. I can probably call myself a custodian of a lot of lived experiences of sexual violence as a criminal and a sexual crimes lawyer specifically, and largely also again in the matrimonial space or in close intimate partner violence situations. So I think I've got some fundamental understanding of how it may be to be in that space, and then of course we are constantly trying to perfect ourselves in trying to be that source of empowerment in within that space for the survivor as lawyers. So I think that becomes our primary responsibility in the larger scheme of things, or of how Shibaji said in the business of gender itself. But having said that, I think I may also speak on this a little more dispassionately, largely because I represent both sides of the spectrum. I will stand for survivors, and I also stand for the abuser, offender, criminal, or the oppressor, or the husband, or the partner. So in both of those spaces, I think my idea of going about the trial or the interpretation of the legislation kind of completely changes, right? So from both ends of the spectrum, I think, yes, to your question, Asabi, whether laws and legislations play any pivotal role in the process of reducing or eliminating gender-based violence. Yes, I think they play an extremely critical role because I think that's also a very preliminary role. I think the preliminary role is because it comes from a place of acknowledgement or acceptance of rights, that this is wrong. And I think as a society, a collective or a government, they can only do it through a formalized legislation. So, and why I'm saying that is because we are currently working in Iraq on something similar, because especially for post-conflict and conflict areas, gender-based violence is not just kind of a byproduct of war. It's sometimes a deliberate military strategy, right? And once that trickles down to society and society kind of normalizes it, then coming back up and then acknowledging it as a violation becomes very difficult. And I think that's the space that Iraq currently is in. So in terms of the implementation of CEDAW and in terms of international commitments or even national commitments to its own women, it's a huge step forward if Iraq, for example, comes up with legislation on domestic violence. Because in terms of India, I completely resonate with Shivaji's perspective on how there are major gaps in terms of how things are implemented. But I think us as stakeholders in this process are largely to blame. I think I would like to accept the responsibility from the sense of a legal fraternity in terms of how gender sensitization training is not given to lawyers, how to handle a survivor is not given to lawyers. That's not part of the law school curriculum, right? So I formerly had the privilege of growing up with 3 extremely strong women. So I might be sensitized to how to handle a situation like that. But there may be lawyers in my place who may not. And that sometimes re-victimizes the survivor or the client, if I may, in that sense. And of course, in the same light, like Shivaji said, there's a lack of police training, judicial training, just general understanding of fundamentals, the key fundamentals of gender-based violence and how it pans out in a real life situation does not exist. But yes, I think without a legislation, we couldn't even dream about going further and establishing what seems like a substantially advanced perspective from someone sitting in Iraq, especially in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, or Yazidi woman for whom sexual crimes is an everyday reality, but to an extent that it's been so normalized and so internalized. So I think, having said that, yes, that's the first part of the question. And in terms of women leaders or men, I think it's a collective responsibility. I think I take that responsibility completely upon myself as a man. Also, as much as I would say that any woman in a particular, anyone who has a voice which is substantial, must use it, and must also self-reflect, because this is also something that we very often see, where women leaders come across and say, oh, I never had to, I was lucky enough to not face any sort of discrimination. I think it's important to then reflect and see whether those minute instances in your early career or major instances on the board of directors of a company where you were cut down or mansplained or not allowed to speak or not allowed to place forward your perspective was in fact holding you back, or was it not gender-based violence? Because I think it is as psychologically violent as it can get if you were to see it like that. So we can't close our eyes to that, and sharing those stories is important, I think, for women leaders.
Thank you. I recognize the merits in everything that all our panelists have just shared. One thing that Sarthak mentioned that I think is not sufficiently ventilated is the unseen aspects of gender-based violence, the psychological and emotional abuse of women, or in other instances, men. It's something that, because it's not visible, it's not as ventilated as physical abuse. But again, the first step in addressing these things is often talking about them and increasing awareness of them. I want to move on to another question. And this one might be a little sensitive, but I think it's important all the same, because while I wholeheartedly support women's empowerment, I think there are so many nuances, because women can both be perpetrators and victims of gender-based violence. And so I'm putting a question to our panelists of whether you think there's any danger that arises from interventions or discussions being disproportionately directed at women. As in, when we constantly paint this narrative that women need to be empowered to avoid gender-based violence. One, are we placing an additional burden on victims? But two, are we masking the fact that women can sometimes be perpetrators? And I'll first call on Angel.
I'll unmute. My thoughts are that I think that discussion overall on gender-based violence has been more focused on women as the survivors and the victims. However, I don't believe that it is masking of the other gender that women could be also perpetrators. We do talk about it, we do mention it, we're talking about it right now. That's not to say that there needs to be, and I'm trying to word this very carefully. Historically, women were the ones without the voice. We're still struggling to find that balance on so many levels. So I find it very hard to, for me to say, well, no, this needs to be a discussion on equal parts of both. I think right now, it's like, this was an analogy brought up before. One house is burning. It's not to say that all houses are burning, or it's not to say your house is not important. Your house is just as important, but this house is burning. So let's put out this fire right now, right? So that analogy can be put on so many issues. And having said that, once again, I like to repeat, I am not here to say that women perpetrators should not be addressed, or that I'm dimming the significance of that. Not at all. But the way our system, laws and cultures and religion and all these things we are literally talking about right now is set up. It's set up to keep the voices down for women. And I think until we could address that, or I personally love to address that and bring us up to at least an equal balance, or even a human value, which I see is the issue here, like the human rights issue, because we're talking about law, yes, we're talking about in the workplace, yes, culturally, but it just even as a systematic human, it's just embedded in our DNA at this point that we've kind of inherited this suppressed, diminished human right as a woman. I think we need to address that first, and that's just, first is not even the right issue, but just that I don't have qualms addressing this. And then also, because addressing this, if we find true gender equality as a human rights issue, then it also, I believe, taps upon the fact that, well, the women shouldn't be perpetrators as well, because it's a power struggle on both sides. It's a power. If a woman, her power is diminished versus her power is inflated, that it addresses what we're discussing, hopefully, addresses both. So I'm not saying that one diminishes the other, but I'm not also saying that one needs to be equal right now. Yeah. Because it is not equal right now. That makes sense.
Yeah. I would like to call on Sheba to comment.
Thank you. Thank you. So I completely agree with Angel, because this has come out of the fact that my own experience, if we come from, if not economically privileged, but for the privilege of education, if the kind of struggle I, as an activist, as a woman, as a human rights defender, I have had to suffer and deal with my own family, in all my relationships, so-called, when you look at me, I'm structurally, physically rather well built, look quite empowered, all of that. But there was so much of internal struggle to manage the different balances in allowing my identity, which was most important to me, as a woman who was working for other other women and girls, to take, the topmost priority. So in that sense, I agree completely with Angel. I don't think that I am in a luxurious position or in that generous moment in my life where I'm going to say, right, Angel, that, let's give guys. And I think this post-feminist, post-gender equality era is very wondering. I have a young daughter who till yesterday I felt was post-feminist. But now that she's reached her 30s, hopefully she'll get what the whole struggle of women's rights has been about, because now she's on her own. She's in another country. She's living in the UK. She's married to a white man, and she's dealing with a lot, right? So let her find her journey on her own way, but maybe she'll understand that none of us have the luxury. See, each generation of women continuingly will have the responsibility to take ahead the gains made by the, it's, like that relay, that race we used to do, handing the torch over to the next person. So you have to protect what has been gained and also build new things. While this time is when we are building new things, in your question was mentioned the whole issue of intersectionality. Okay, what are the different dimensions that are affecting gender-based violence? See, the thing is that women also are able to other each other. In our roles, if I'm a mother-in-law, once I get into the mother-in-law shoes, I behave in a particular way. I mean, I might, So one is the roles that come in our way. As enlightened as we may be, those roles might come in the way when all our patriarchal, subconscious comes to the surface. Then in India, like you all have, I mean, globally we have the issue of race. In India, we have the thing of color. Fair skin, dark skin, all of that matters in India. Caste, what is my caste? What is my religion? All of this, back in the 80s, when we started out, it was a romantic, beautiful world. I mean, we would have eradicated poverty, brought about gender equality, and we didn't know that there were so many differences. But today, your generation is dealing with a lot. I mean, I must admit, dealing with a lot of new, overwhelming. So you cannot afford to let go of that, space as feminists, as women's rights activists, or whatever it is, and while you respect and intersect with other groups and identities, I think that this is the time when we have to, because we're also in the midst of a backlash, I think. See, we have so many legislations and so many things, but while there was dialogue between the women's movement and the women's rights movement from the West, developed countries and underdeveloped countries and developing countries, we all brought in the dimension of, we dialogued with each other and brought in the whole thing about cultures, religions, different practices, manifestations of oppression, manifestations of liberations. We said we didn't want to be judged. I mean, some of our cultures gave a lot of importance to families. So we really shouted down women of the West, saying that you think it's about individualism. So we have arrived at this place, understanding our different contexts. And I think so early we can't give it up, because we've not completed and reached and arrived, and we still need to arrive at on one side. And on the other side, the way the nature of crimes against women have completely, this entire thing of cybercrime, I mean, online sexual harassment, come on. So it just keeps on. The way child sexual abuse is rampant. Yes, all of this would have been there from the day one. But the fact that it's really grown and amplified, and what we are doing at the grassroots or in different groups across the globe is obviously not adequately enough to deal with this pandemic. This is no longer a silent emergency, it's a very loud, blaring emergency that's happening on the count of abuse of women and children. So I do think that we need to see all these connections. While you're talking about psychosocial, I'm just sharing a tiny experience. I'm so glad to hear Sarthak is working in Iraq. Sarthak, there's a small experience I want to share. In 2002, see, there was this violence in Gujarat, which were against minorities. I was just working on gender-based violence before that in normal times. But in those circumstances, when I was working with survivors of sexual violence, I didn't get a single psychiatrist or psychologist to come and work because the victims were Muslims. I had to import a woman, a Parsi woman, psychiatrist from Delhi. There was only one institution from the south of India called NIMHANS that came in to do mental health work. So the point is that there's misogyny on one side, but this misogyny is getting women support because of the multiple identities women have. We don't operate as just women. We operate in so many colors, cultures, and identities that it is influencing the way we look at violence that other women are experiencing.
Thank you, Sheba. Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone to be mindful that the time for our session today is limited. And so we've got a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that everyone is able to comment. So we'll move on to another question.
Yeah.
And this is regarding the idea that religion or culture can be used to rationalize or justify gender-based violence. I don't think there is a place for cultural relativism, but I'm eager to hear the panel's views. And I'll go to Ambassador Hazelle first, followed by Sarthak.
Thank you. I think there is no room for it and there is no place for it. If we go back to, I think, what you said, and also what Hermina said in her remarks, we speak of CEDAW. All of our countries are signatories to CEDAW. It speaks specifically to those issues of cultural and traditional practices that discriminate against women. And when we look at it from the point of view of not only the discrimination against women, but the violation of some women's bodies, the forcing of marriages, etc., and the fact that to a large extent, some people believe that because we can couch it in either traditional or cultural or religious context, that it's okay. And I don't think it's okay. I think also, even in our own region, we have some taboos. The issue of sexual molestation of children, for one. Those are things that we can all pretend and think that it's okay, it's this region or that region, it's this culture or that culture, it's allowed in this religion or that tradition, and use it as a way, as I sometimes say, to pretend that we're ostriches. But we're not. And we can't pretend that we're ostriches. And so I think that as we discuss this even more, we have to consider those persons who are subjected to these acts because of religion, culture, or tradition, in addition to everything else that, that we're dealing with. It has to be a holistic approach. It just has to be. Sheba spoke about going back 30 years, and I chuckled, Sheba. I just chuckled because, yeah. When I was on CEDAW and a rapporteur on CEDAW, I got an opportunity over those years to see how discrimination against women and girls were interpreted in the different regions, by the different countries, the justification for it. And like I said, I'm just now adopting the hashtag enough already.
I like that, enough already. Sarthak, do you want to share any comments on this question?
Yes. Again, thank you, Her Excellency. I think that completely, I think, summed up what my conclusion of the remarks would have been. So I won't go to those. I think I can skip those now. But I think in terms of whether religion, custom, or culture in any way can influence anyone else's, a third party's perspective to perceive gender violence or an incident of gender violence is immaterial, I think, because it's a cause and effect. It's that simplified for me. I think everything in the middle of the reasoning of why it happened becomes immaterial at the point of time when it has happened. But as someone working towards prevention, I think those are very important concepts to understand and kind of engage with and kind of change perspective for the perpetrators and societies at large on. I think there are several considerations in terms of female genital mutilation, marital rape. Even when we talk about gender-based violence, we definitely can't forget the violence perpetrated against the LGBTQIA+ community, transgender violence. So these are also huge sections of arising out of religion predominantly. And this is where Shivaji's initial point of how nationalistic governments, I think nationalistic or theocratic governments or governments which run on religion as an important parameter for community organization in general, will in a sense see a deterioration in women's human rights or gender-based, or an increase or a spike in gender-based violence as a necessary product of it. So I think, yes, governmental policies play a huge role in this, and especially when it comes to situations like Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, where these are quasi-judicially endorsed by religious organizations in the name of fatwas or in the name of this is fine because this is a gay man or this is a lesbian woman, so you can act with her in a particular way. So of course the actions remain the same insofar as the legal mandate is concerned, but I think the motivation becomes different, and that motivation we need to delve in terms of its prevention for sure. So we need to acknowledge that it exists first of all.
Thank you, Sarthak. Moving on, I wanted to talk about the current moment that we're in, that is COVID-19, because a number of national and international studies have indicated that gender-based violence has rapidly and significantly increased. And people have speculated, and some studies have actually shown that it is linked to increased stay-at-home orders, the increased mentally draining situation that we're in. But I'm eager to hear the perspective of our panelists on the current spike in gender-based violence. I would again call on Ambassador Hazelle, followed by Sheba.
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing here is a reaction to even further frustration and ways of persons trying to cope and not coping very well with the lockdown, the whole idea of quarantining, persons not being able to go to work, etc. I think you would have heard this before, in that, for example, you would hear that when new legislation is enacted, there is a new level of reporting of cases. And the people would say, oh, there's an increase in incidents of domestic violence. There wasn't an increase in incident. Those incidents were there. What happens is that with the enactment of legislation, persons felt like they were given a voice. They had something that they could lean into, and they had some new hope. And with that new hope, they become more open, and it helps to break the silence. And I'm hoping that this is where we're headed with this discussion and other discussions like this, dealing with the effects of COVID on victims of domestic violence, gender-based violence, irrespective of age, ethnicity, religion, sex or gender, whichever one is comfortable with. I think we just need to start looking at this whole picture or this whole question in a holistic manner.
Thank you, Sheba.
So considering, if I can speak about India, the fact is that our response plan, there is no comprehensive plan around the COVID here on gender-based violence. There's no overt acknowledgement that this level of domestic violence or that women are living in fearful situations within their homes. Maybe children also are living in fearful situations. If there is an acknowledgement, a tacit acknowledgement is when it becomes easier for civil society groups to cooperate with the government, which is already overburdened with this entire COVID pandemic. So in that sense, I'm trying to be empathetic to the fact that this is a global pandemic. Governments have not been prepared. We don't know about the symptomatic, asymptomatic, kind of signs of the COVID, which keeps changing. People are not, many in our country find it difficult to culturally adapt to the whole thing of masks and social distancing, and 3 lockdowns, 4 lockdowns, which happened, so suddenly, has already traumatized civil society very severely. And we are in a complete economic meltdown. In that, the government is feeling that, I mean, where do our frontline workers or our health services or the police or anybody have enough time to, give that much kind of a specific focus to gender-based violence? Nonetheless, there has been several petitions in the high courts in different parts of the country, and every time the response of the government to the high courts have been that we do have helplines, we are allowing protection officers to move around. So once these kind of replies are given to the high courts, the whole thing dissipates. But on the ground, the fact is that women fear going to hospitals if there has been severe violence they have experienced, and they won't go to police stations in these kind of COVID times. So obviously they are relying more on their neighborhood support mechanisms or family members or something like that if the scope is there. The National Commission for Women in India has said that our ASHA workers and our Anganwadi workers, I mean, these are our flagship programs. So they are saying that these frontline workers are open to receiving complaints on gender-based violence. So at this time, it's I'm just presenting the facts here, that at this time, things are really not looking so good. And the mainstream media or any other people with responsibility are definitely talking of mental health, talking of the COVID pandemic in every other context, social, economic, all of that. But nobody is, except a few articles or some news items, gender-based violence is really not on the minds of any mainstream, responsible actors as it should be. That's what I feel at the moment vis-a-vis COVID pandemic. Yes, UN Women is saying things, groups at the grassroots must be doing things, but as a national issue, we are more worried recently about a suicide of an actor, and suicide rates are very high in India. Despite that, we are very preoccupied with these kind of, petty politics and how that whole thing has panned out in India.
Thank you, Sheba. So there's so much that I wish we could have discussed today, but time is of the essence. So I wanted to open the entire the call to all participants for our last question. Earlier, when Ambassador Hazelle spoke, and as well as in my introductory remarks, we talked about how education and empowerment are only viable solutions in some instances, but not always. So I'm eager to hear the reflections of all participants on what other concrete and actionable steps we can take to address violence against women and girls. And this is open to anyone. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Oh, and before I proceed, I also wanted to specially acknowledge Miss Yolanda Oliver. She runs Fearless Gems, and I wanted to specially acknowledge her and also make sure that she knows that if she wants to comment on this, she's more than welcome to.
Hi, I'm speaking, but I don't know how to raise my hand. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you for the acknowledgement and thank you for the invitation. I thank you guys for coming together and sharing your knowledge of your experience about gender-based violence. One of our key missions is educating the masses about domestic violence, but I think the most critical component that we can do around education is really getting to parents, getting in schools, and getting into organizations so we could teach children and people about healthy relationships so they can understand how to build healthy relationships so they don't end up in relationships of abuse. I think that's where the core is, and we could spend our time and energy any place. It would be educating about what healthy relationships look like. That's my feedback.
Thank you. And for everyone on the call, Miss Oliver actually runs a shelter. So she would have firsthand experience with victims of gender-based violence. So thank you for sharing your reflections. If anyone else wishes to comment, please.
Asabi, if I can just quickly comment on this, Keshav this side.
Of course.
In Rajasthan, I was working with one of our partner organizations around 3 to 4 years back at the India-Pakistan border in a town which is very famous called Jaisalmer. So we saw that there was only one counselor in the entire city for everybody, and rich families, because of caste and religion, used to keep women as their possession, if you understand what I mean, objectifying them as possessions. And they were given enough food and resources, but not educated, married off early, and then it was found out that the father was raping the wife and the daughter after getting drunk every day, and the daughter tried to commit suicide a couple of times. I happened to meet the counselor, and I found out that when she went to the police to complain, they asked her, "What is your business?" And if the family is thrown out, the girl and the woman are thrown out after the police complaint, after the husband is arrested, where will they go? Asabi, that's a very common mindset phenomenon in India because of poverty, of lack of education for women and support systems. So I feel that that shelter is a great thing that was identified even by my partner organization, but then the sustainability funding of that shelter and the scale of that shelter, because it is such a prevalent issue in India, especially if I can say. So that was a very complex issue that even I could not wrap my head around, and I'm still always searching for stakeholders to partner with to overcome that at a process level. Thank you.
Thank you, Keshav. I mean, that's just very heartbreaking to hear, and it's unfortunate that that is the story of hundreds of thousands of women and girls. Angel, the floor is yours.
We have talked about law implementation, we've talked about counseling, and I want to tie back to what something Sheba said, which was really reflective of my feeling, a holistic approach. Meaning, you know, we talked about, Sheba has said, there's law in place, but the implementation of it is not supported. And so much of that, as we talked about, is the lack of counseling, the lack of support if someone reports something. For children, I mean, it really is like when we talk about education, it's not just education to adults, education to the children so that they don't continue this vicious cycle in their own upbringing, because we become our parents, right? If we don't know what a healthy relationship is like, we have no idea that we are in one ourselves, because we create the same toxic environments. This is all we know. This is what we think it is. So it is inherited in so many senses. This cultural imbalance is inherited, but also just this power, this imbalance of power is inherited. And, you know, like there's so much to this, because the women empowerment, that term is so broad, and it's not just economic empowerment, because yes, you know, there are women in power who are still in positions of being abused because they don't, because it's a psychological and an emotional training that we've had to that puts us down. So I really do believe in counseling and education in that sense, and it goes from children to adults, survivors, and you know, hopefully post and preventative and all that. It's a full spectrum, and it is absolutely a very complicated issue. But, you know, perhaps not just punishing the perpetrators. There was something that someone had said earlier, which was really, you know, brought a light in me, because a lot of the wives or the family, the girlfriends, whoever it is, doesn't want to report their significant other because they don't want them to be criminalized, thrown in jail. There should be levels of this. There should be levels of maybe it's treatment, rehab, therapy, not just jail time, punishment. Now, obviously, there's certain offenses that I believe is punishable by jail, right? Or harsher, whatever it is. However, the full spectrum of things is that perhaps there's a way to quietly address such issues, but not bring it to a point, not have it become counterproductive in that it becomes punishment, and fearing of that punishment. You know, it same goes for rape victims, right? You don't want the backlash of coming out with that to become you, to be your identity. You've already experienced it, and now the backlash of all that. So this I think there's so many layers to all this, but I believe there is a quote, the holistic approach, which is this, you know, 360 approach, and to tap it in all these different levels that we talked about today. It's not just one.
Thank you, Angel. I am myself a proponent for the idea that we need a holistic approach. Sometimes I realize that victims of domestic violence can even feel a guilt in naming their abuser. And we talked as well earlier about the economic impacts, you know, then they have to fare, if I do speak up, what circumstances would my children face? Am I jeopardizing my well-being? So this is a multifaceted situation. I want to call on a participant in the call, Victor, to give his reflections. Victor is from Nigeria. Okay. Well, it seems that he's not prepared yet. So if anyone else wishes to comment, please.
I would like to make a comment. Sorry, I just joined. Good morning, everybody. Hi, my name is Naima. As you see, my last name is the same as Ambassador's. That's my mom. And I'm a psychologist. I currently live and work in St. Kitts, Nevis. And I actually wanted to support something that Angel said, if you don't mind me calling you by your first name, Angel, about holistic care. And one of the issues I've been having, I'm a psychologist, and I actually moved a bit away from working in psychology and doing more work in youth development. And since COVID began, I have moved right back into full-term counseling because of the increase in reporting. I don't think there's an increase in cases. I think it's just become an increase in reporting the cases because it's become something that's difficult for people to live with. St. Kitts is a very small society. We're 55,000 people. So a big issue for us with reporting is the guilt and shame that I just heard you speaking of. But what I found when I first began, it was like I went right back into my regular advocacy, you know, looking at counseling and education, holistic victim advocacy for children. But then I realized it's such a it's such a deep-rooted cultural problem. There's an acceptance almost of predatory behavior, particularly in the small islands. I can speak for my island. It's an acceptance, a cultural practice of protecting predators that makes it even more difficult for persons to come forth, particularly in this time. And there's a lot of shame associated with it. And through my counseling, one of the things I realized is, like, I'm not running out of predators. Like, I want to continue to help victims, but there's really nothing in place to help predators. There's really nothing in place to help abusers. There's very little in place to address that aspect of the issue. So the holistic development, I think we have to start changing the dialogue. So, I started in the dialogue, just talking about abuse in our culture was unheard of. So, we just talk about it. I just started a little conversation here, a little thing here on Facebook, a little advocacy there, a little thing on the radio, until people started to talk about it. And now we're ready to move into the next phase. But I never thought the next phase would be for me counseling abusers. And that's really where the work has taken me in COVID. But I think if I had not been in COVID, I wouldn't have been inclined, even though I'm trained in the Good Life model, which I think is an excellent model for particularly sexually violent abusers. I'm trained in it. It just never occurred to me that that was something that was needed. But something that's come out for me is how much it is needed for us to be looking at the whole problem and not just because sometimes we help the victims and they end up back in the same situations in a different home, a different family with a different partner, or we help one victim and then they leave, and then that perpetrator just goes and finds a new victim somewhere else. So I think we have to, as advocates, as people working in the field, really need to start putting more focus also on looking at abusers and predators and trying to find healing for them as well.
Thank you, Naima. And I'm very happy, despite the seriousness of today's conversation, I'm happy to hear so many Caribbean voices on this call, given that I myself am from the Caribbean. And you're right, there are some embedded structures in our islands that, to me, I think enable abusers and normalize or trivialize this culture. With that being said, if no one else has any comments, I will hand over to Jasmine to move the vote of thanks. It was my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. Like I said at the opening, this is something that is very much prevalent in my home country. So I'm very deeply touched by this issue. It was my pleasure having this conversation with all of you. And now, Jasmine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Asabi. I think personally for me, all the gender dialogues that have happened till now, it's been a very informative and interactive session. If I talk about like the issue of gender-based violence, it is something that I have seen personally working with students at the grassroots level and the kind of challenges they face. And when I talk about violence, sometimes it's not just the women who are there who face issues of violence, but also men sometimes who come across these issues, and the people from LGBTQ community. And the issues often, for example, I'll tell you, like when a girl comes home and says that a guy whistled at me, it's often the woman in the house who says, it's okay, you know, he just whistled. But what we forget is that just whistling is also a form of sexual harassment. And if it is not controlled at that point of time, it can lead to far-reaching consequences, because it is kind of taken as, okay, you know, she wants that kind of a scenario which is created. And often at times in our household, especially if I talk about the Indian context, and sometimes it's across the world, but where the victim is further victimized when she goes in for reporting, either at the hands of the law or the people surrounding, whom we call the society, and sometimes they say she asked for it. So it's very important that whatever changes or laws that are constituted are not just mere words on paper. Rather, every individual should take the responsibility to create an awareness about existing laws, and also ensuring a compassionate and a sensitive view of the whole issue, which often in India I face lacking in the police systems. Even if women are there in the police areas and when we go and report a crime of sexual violence, the kind of comments that we get to hear from those women is very devastating. And I, as a counselor myself, don't have any answer for it. So imagine the poor victim. She's already under so much pressure. She doesn't know, he or she, whoever it is, they themselves don't know what happened to them, because it was not something they were waiting to happen. It's not like, it's something that they wanted to. So it's shocking for them. They are traumatized and they undergo further trauma. So all these kind of actions, when we call about collective actions, it needs to be ensured that they are accompanied with a compassionate and a sensitive view as well. So before I give the vote of thanks, I would like all the panelists to kindly give their closing remarks, and then I'll continue. And then I'll continue with my vote of thanks. After the panelist, I would also like Keshav to give his remarks. We can start with Angel.
Thank you, everyone this is such a necessary conversation. And there's so much more to be said, and there's so many layers, and I wish I could just dig into everybody's experiences and brain cells, because I've experienced the full spectrum of a survivor of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence. It's all part of my life. So, our conversation today really stirred a lot of reflection on, how it could have been prevented, how it could have been dealt better, the aftermath, both for victims and perpetrators. And I really do believe in, quote, the holistic approach, because the counseling that I talk about really is the rehabilitation of both parties, because it's not just punishing one and taking care of the other. It really needs to be both. You need to guide them both so that it doesn't continue, that one doesn't continue to seek toxic environments or create it unknowingly, or continue to put themselves in one and stay in one and heal from that. And the support needs to go from both sides, because the perpetrator will absolutely do it again. So the counseling, I believe, really does need to go both ways. And once again, without taking time from it, because there's just my mind is just churning. There's so much to talk about, and I really am grateful to be a part of today's conversation. So thank you, Romina, for having me here, and honored to speak with so many and hear from you. You have so much information that really inspired me to do more work, and my work is in the media. So really, for me, I'm trying to really, I seek to do my work, have my voice heard, have these conversations be more prevalent in the work that I choose and create, because I think that is a way to reach the general public. Whether it's through film and TV and movies and podcasts, whatever that is. The more we discuss this, the more it is less of the stigma attached to it, that we can't talk about it. The more we talk about it, the more we can heal from this generational trauma that I think we've inherited all these years. So thank you, everyone, once again.
Next, would Sheba ma'am would like to go?
I want to thank you, Jasmine, for including me, and because through you, I have been invited to this panel, but Asabi, the ambassador, all the earlier speakers, and Angel and Sarthak. It's been really wonderful talking with people who are so sincere. You know, the ring of sincerity, the pain, the anguish, the emotions that all of us have experienced in these 2 hours has really been very moving and very re energizing. But I think that we really have to keep in mind that we are not in good times globally in each of our countries. We don't have the larger political environment is not supportive to promote non-violence. Unless there is a context of non-violence, of rule of law, principles of non-discrimination, overall, state obligations, civil responsibility, the fact that all of us have been part of processes of national and international instruments like CEDAW. We've tried to cooperate with governments and do advocacy and get them to implement, to do due diligence. Now this entire environment globally, if you look at America, United States of America, any other country, is completely dissipated. Now this is most fearful, because if governments and international organizations are not able to assert about the overall human rights principles, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so many things, then in that context do we exist as human beings, or to whichever genders we belong? Our rights are going to be further diminished. So the overall conversation, unless it's about non-violence and accountability, non-discrimination and equality, how is it that we are going to push our agendas? We are going to do tidbits of good. We all are going to put our drops of work into the ocean. But the larger milieu is also something we have to worry about. How are we going to overcome it? How are we going to regain some of that ground for our present, current generations and for our future generations? We are worried about our future generations because they have a hard task in reinstating human rights. And nothing is alien and foreign. See, human rights should be integral to every single society on this earth. Compassion, every religion, every culture, may it be tribal, whatever form of principles they have followed, over generations and millions of years, we are evolving as human beings. So I think it's important that we keep that central to our understanding, that between countries we can't argue like this, that this is a foreign concept to us. Because are we then diminishing our own cultures, our own religions, our own civilizations by saying that we are inhuman? And are we not all here to evolve? So please let us move ahead. Thank you all very much. We have to keep this battle for a violence-free world going. Thank you very much, and thank you for the patience. And thank you to all the participants and the organizers. I hope these kind of dialogues and works keep continuing. Thank you.
Next, can we have Sarthak for your closing remarks?
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. I think every time I get the opportunity to sit on one of these panels, I feel it's more of a privilege than an opportunity to share space with some incredible women. And I see that a lot in happening around me. And I think every time that I am granted that opportunity, I keep myself open to flowing and changing and amending what I thought before the panel. And I think a lot of those perspectives have changed today as well. And they will constantly keep changing with the times and the people we will engage with. So thank you, Angel, Sheba ji, and Her Excellency, and of course, Naima, Jasmine, Keshav, of course, and most importantly, Asabi. It's such a privilege to join you here. Having said that, I think there's so many perspectives, and like Angel said, so many layers to peel that I could sit here for the entire evening, keep peeling inside of me and for inside of all of you. Time, unfortunately, we're already at 7, so I think I'm overdoing what I'm supposed to. Thank you so much for all of your perspectives. And I think I'll just leave you with one remark, something that we haven't extensively discussed, and that is cyber sexual crimes. So I think that is something that is happening a lot, and especially I'm sure Angel must have to deal with a lot of that in the media space, especially when you're an influencer, if you have a voice. And it can be something as simple as a Facebook message, something as simple as a comment on Facebook, but that is gender-based violence. So it's all around us. It's just time that we start acknowledging it, that it is what it is, instead of brushing it under the carpet. Yeah, thank you.
Can we have Your Excellency Rosalyn Hazelle speak, give her closing remarks?
In the interest of time, I would just like to support all that I've heard during this discussion. I think it was very rich. There were a lot of ideas that were put forward, and I believe that we have a great source of information embedded in all of us who participated today, including the participants who may not have spoken up. I will just close with reminding us that in our current realities, what used to be victims who were afraid of the dark is now 24/7 because of COVID. And I think that that's a focus that we need to move on with, think about as we restructure, replan, and as we take up the hashtag enough already. Thank you to the organizers for including me. I feel very blessed, and I believe that I received a lot of information and a lot of food for thought. Have a great evening, have a great day, wherever you happen to be in the time zone. Love ya.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Piera, we would like some closing remarks from you as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for watching the video. And I'm really hoping that you can support it when it comes out on the 28th of September, and to share it on your platforms for Signal for Help. So we all know this sign or are aware of this sign to help all of these victims of domestic violence. So thank you again.
Keshav, may I call upon you, please?
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I think one thing that we did sort of not talk about a lot that I would have really liked the layers was just how it is getting reinforced through media, through a lot of kind of lyrics of songs which demean women, which objectify them. And a very strong example from my own work was when I was at a school with teenage girls, 300 of them in a room. And there's a very famous local rap song that we have here, which really like glorifies rape culture, forced, no consent, like any hip hop song that does happen. Now I'm all for freedom of expression, but I feel that that is what is also one of the very key factors in normalizing all of this and glorifying it with teenagers. And with a lot of unregulated social media and tech now moving out, a lot of those issues, like Sarthak also talked about, the other part of it, the cyber crime porn part of it, and those kind of aspects is also something we would love to, I would have really liked to eventually hear, because that's a big part of change. Like Piera has used the same power of media and songs, and Angel is using the same power of media to create a more positive understanding of male-female relationship. As against those songs which are also sometimes saying, do that to a girl, do this to a girl, drive her around in a car, all she's is a gold digger. And we know the big ones also, all of us have done it. But what changed when I sat with those women on the same song was when I asked one of them to get away from the music and speak the lyrics and just translate it to me in regular English. And the moment she said it and the 300 girls heard it, in those English words that I will rape you and take you and I don't need your consent. I will just call the father and get him his consent on raping you because I have XYZ cars and XYZ houses and XYZ these. So that is what changed with those 300 girls. I didn't have to sensitize them anymore because they knew this was wrong. So on an actions and a positive front, I'm just sharing a video with all of you. It's a video of a poem that was done by grassroots girls from India on spreading awareness on female infanticide and feticide, which is a very prevalent practice in India. It is called Ladki Samajhkar, which means presuming I'm a girl, don't kill me in the womb. So that is what it is, and it will show you some of the glimpses of what kind of grassroots action can be done by young people with especially the most vulnerable communities. And I would just like to credit every team member of that project and every one of you for ensuring that we are getting to see this today. And with that, I will just completely be closing anything for today from my side. So just calling your attention, it is in Hindi. So especially if any of you, Jasmine, in your vote of thanks can explain what it means, it will be really nice.
बस लड़की समझकर so this is a part of our poetry only as a home certificate like this गिर जाऊं तो उठाना मत बस लड़की समझकर समझ जाऊं तो हिलाना मत बस लड़की समझकर रो जाऊं तो छोड़ना मत बस लड़की समझकर कुछ चाहूं तो दुकाना भी मत बस लड़की समझकर अकेली हूं तो हमदर्दी जताना मत बस लड़की समझकर सहारा देना मत बस लड़की समझकर खेल के मैदान में जाने देना मत बस लड़की समझकर रसोई घर में बेच देना मत बस लड़की समझकर वो तीन तलाक आजमाना मत बस लड़की समझकर बात बात पर नीचा दिखाना मत बस लड़की समझकर शॉर्ट पहनो तो टोकना मत बस लड़की समझकर थोड़ा सा तेज हो जाऊं तो रोकना मत बस लड़की समझकर शादी के लिए लड़का खुद ढूंढना चाहूँ तो नकारना मत बस लड़की समझकर अगर आगे बढ़ना चाहूँ तो पाबंदी लगाना मत बस लड़की समझकर मेरी हर बात को नजरअंदाज करना मत बस लड़की समझकर मेरे जीने का हक हथियाना मत बस लड़की समझकर अगर सर पर चुन्नी की जगह गमछा बांधूं तो चिल्लाना मत बस लड़की समझकर अगर अपने करियर को आगे बढ़ाना चाहूँ तो टोकना मत बस लड़की समझकर अगर मैं नन्ही सी परी आऊं बनकर तो मेरी जान लेना मत बस लड़की समझकर जब आसमान में ऊंची उड़ती जाऊं तो पंख काटना मत बस लड़की समझकर and then the last just one thing that if you still think that a boy is more superior than a girl then that's the worst thought which can occur in a thought.
Imagine no possession. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, or brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one.
Thank you all for watching. Jasmine, if you want to just tell for our non-Hindi audience or anyone what it means to you.
Thank you so much, Keshav. I believe it resonates. If I talk from my perspective, every girl who's there on the call right now who can understand Hindi can very well relate to it, that every point that I try to take in life, be it related to my education or the choice of person I wish to marry, or the very fact what I want to do in life is controlled by so many conditions, terms and conditions or asterisks attached, which these girls are saying, please don't put it just because I happen to be a girl. Like, the choices are determined even in terms of profession, that you can do XYZ profession because you're a girl, whereas a boy has full freedom to choose what he wants. Or when I want to play a sport or indulge in activities which are often considered as a boy, please don't consider or stop me just because I'm a girl. So the words actually resonate with everyone who can understand the meaning of it. And really thank you for putting forward this today. So we are now coming to the conclusions of this session. And as someone said, it's not just the ending, it's the beginning with a healthy discussion that happens over here. Each one of us is going back with a good sense of learning. And this couldn't be possible without some people on call right now. So I would like to thank Ambassador Rosalyn for expressing and sharing some wonderful insights. Also the panelists, Sheba ji, Angel, Sarthak, for being here and presenting their views and experiences, which help us to rethink our ideologies, and also looking forward to what changes we can bring at our individual level, and take forward those learnings to build up a collective initiative to bring about the changes that we actually want to see on ground. I want to thank Asabi, who has moderated the session today, and thank you for helping out each time. Fiera, thank you so much for helping us to start the session on a wonderful note with that beautiful song that you composed. We'll remember it and hope you can share with us these songs. I would like to thank Keshav, who's been there and helped us out each time we have thought of an idea. And above all, as the person with whom I'm working, I can completely say that he's one person who's totally gender sensitive, and we in the team can be very open about any issues that we are facing, and he's always ensured that our voices are heard. And Harmeena, of course, we live across two different time zones, but we know the kind of coordination that goes on between us. So thank you for everything, for everyone who's there on the panel and the participants who have joined us for this session. Before we go, I would like to mention that the next session on gender is on 28th of September, and the topic will be mental health, which is again very important because all the issues that we have discussed so far in all the 5 gender dialogues did have a bearing on this mental health as well. So I look forward to seeing you all on the session. So thank you once again.
And thank you, Jasmine, for your leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, everybody. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.